I have a lot of people tell me that that's their favorite movie of all time. And that's another that a lot of people had to go watch 4 times.
Interstellar, for me, Interstellar remains my favorite movie I've ever been in. You know, that's at the top of my list. Yeah. That's the one I go back to and watch.
Well, we used to look up in the sky and wonder at our place in the stars. Now we just look down and worry about our place in the dirt.
There was a time when there was a greater cultural tendency to believe in the prospect of something better, not just for ourselves, but for humanity as a whole. Through science and art, we could grow our understanding of the world around us, finding a perfect nexus of the subjective emotional human experience and the immutable world around us. No matter the numbers or equations on a page, we believed that the truth of love, of deep feeling, was something as powerful as the natural world. So much so that a collective human desire for change could address any problem we might confront as a species. But we live in a cynical age, and its malign influence can be seen everywhere you look. Political polarization has grown exponentially over the last decade through algorithms that sow division because that's what most stokes frenzied engagement. Doom and resignation are exploited by corporate profiteers who thrive on fear, and the average consumer can't be blamed for being paralyzed by it. We can't achieve collective action if the platforms we use to communicate are designed to keep us apart.
I see a disturbing trend of cynicism right now, and that scares me because I think that doesn't serve anybody. It doesn't make you smarter, it doesn't make you more prepared, it doesn't make you enjoy your life more.
This negativity is born of a resignation to mounting global crises that feel so fundamentally beyond our control as to make individual efforts feel utterly futile. Instead of uniting against a common enemy, we unite against ourselves. Maybe you ask yourself, what can I do in the face of pandemics, geopolitical violence, and rising temperatures? The answer? More than you think. The complacency, that's our greatest challenge.
This film, it's very much an ode or a homage to the humans as a species and their abilities.
The basis of our human spirit, our sense of adventure, our sense of science, our sense of the impossible. It captures it in such an emotional way. It's a spiritual connection.
If you hear the term quantum physics and think of something cold, clinical, and matter-of-fact, I mean, you would be like most people, but within its endless theorization, there's a radically hopeful humanitarian message hiding behind the PhD programs and dense academic language. What quantum physicists seek to do is abandon the concepts of the physical world that we take for granted and reduce them to their most fundamental parts. As the discipline has grown, rather than furthering some neat categorization, their perception of the world has grown stranger and more wondrous. Now, before your eyes glaze over and say, hey man, you know what, I subscribe to your channel for FilmSpeak, not Science Dork Speak. Well, hey, just trust me when I say that I'm going somewhere with this. As quantum physicists have reduced the physical world to its smallest component pieces, a theory has emerged that is held by many of its greatest minds, and it is both terrifying and exciting. To put it in the simplest terms possible, physicists have concluded that in the particle world, which is to say the most granular observable components of our reality, particles can exist in multiple states simultaneously. For this reason, their reality depends on the act of observation, and thus our reality is, on some level, constructed by us. If the world around us is, at some level, constructed by human feeling, then abstract concepts like love and familial bonds take on a whole new form. If we collectively extend outward with love and hope, we have the capacity, should we dare to dream this big, to save ourselves.
I like the combination of aesthetics and science, if you like, Penrose steps, things like that. And you know, they're art, they're artistic, but they're very mathematical, they're very scientific. I'm very fascinated by that relationship.
These thought-provoking ideas that exist at a nexus of philosophy, human emotion, and traditional research science are at the core of Christopher Nolan's breathtaking humanist masterpiece, Interstellar, a story that is as much about the vastness of space as it is about the power of the human heart.
I became interested in the idea of artifacts of higher dimensions. The idea that you could view human emotion, particular forms of human connectivity, as not so much, they're not dimensions themselves, but they're artifacts potentially of higher dimensions in which we are spatially, physically, scientifically connected in ways that we can't actually understand.
The filmmaker, whose career to this point had been categorized by exacting filmmaking, equal parts thrilling and emotionally detached, would throw audiences the most unexpected curveball by offering up a bleeding heart space epic about family. In the words of Tom Schoen, author of the Nolan Variations, a resource we're gonna use a lot in this video, after a career in which impersonal, as jostled only by cold, was the go-to pejorative for critics addressing his work, Interstellar was a plangent hymn to family connection, a weepy no less, in which time plays the role usually reserved for distance. With Interstellar, Christopher Nolan was reborn. Let's talk about how Interstellar changed me. In college, I drove over an hour to see Interstellar properly in 70mm IMAX. No, I wasn't gonna go see this in any dinky theater. I was gonna fucking see this thing the way God, Christopher Nolan, and the universe intended me to see this at the Indianapolis Science Center, one of like the very few theaters in the country that can project true 70mm IMAX. I dragged my friends who had cars, because I was an out-of-state kid at the time, so I didn't have a car, to take me, and just sat there in utter amazement. Like, it was, at the time, the greatest theatrical experience I ever witnessed. Hell, it still might be, given the day. Regardless, it's easily a top 5. It shattered me emotionally. It made me believe that there still might be some hope left in this world, some goodness. It allowed me to connect with the universe and my place within it in a way I hadn't really considered prior, and as someone who can have major anxiety that leads to existential spirals, and believe me, those are not fun, there was almost something comforting about the universal constant of love and collective empathy. It was the first time I really took an extreme interest in science, if I'm being honest with you. I remember it was such a phenomenon. Our school's physics professor, I went to Purdue University, so a big engineering school, but also one with a lot of unexpected creative opportunities. So the environment I was in felt true to the spirit of the film, a movie that celebrated science and creativity and served as the marriage of the two. And the way it was received on campus because of that created such fervor. But going back to those physics professors, they gave open lectures on the science behind the film. My engineering and STEM friends felt seen and excited about their field of study in a way I hadn't seen since, and I think it was because it's a film that is in love with science and has the verisimilitude to portray that passion authentically. It's a film that also rejects the notion of STEM in favor of STEAM, in favor of the arts, a way of interpreting the objectivity around us that allows culture to flourish and collective empathy to exist. Seeing Interstellar at the age that I did in that environment, it not only gave me a greater appreciation for the power of film, but it only further caused me to follow my creative pursuits, but with perhaps more consideration and perspective than I had prior. I knew I loved film and I wanted to be involved in that field in some capacity, but watching Interstellar solidified it. I mean, I talked ad nauseum about my love of Inception and how that was my cinematic awakening. Interstellar is the next step forward in that journey for me as a person. I had so much to say, so much to express. I wanted to make my own movies afterwards. I wanted to figure out the techniques and paint on a canvas as large as Christopher Nolan. I think as an audience member, Interstellar made me much more aware and cognizant of the foundations of cinema, sight, sound, and the ability of these spectacular images to evoke very real, relatable, and understandable emotions. It got me to start thinking emotionally, subjectively, about how I watched movies, about the depth behind every frame and the power they have to inspire and enact real change. And now, 10 years later, I had the pleasure of revisiting this masterpiece in IMAX with its recent re-release, and fuck man, if I didn't just bawl my goddamn eyes out. It's the film I needed. It's the film you need. No, it's the film we need. I have always loved Interstellar, but in celebrating its 10th anniversary, I'm truly taken aback by how much more resonant the film is in the wake of a global pandemic and an uptick in natural disasters. We have always known the Earth has been shaped by human behavior, but this becomes more and more evident all the time. And while there is an understandable impulse to resign to overwhelm, we can't lose sight of the fact that human love for our families, for strangers, and a spirit of hope and ingenuity provides a justifiable optimism for the future. And while we may not ever literally defy gravity, you see what I did there? You enjoy the topical reference, you bastards? My humor setting is at 65%. Interstellar reminds us that pessimism is our greatest enemy and love our greatest cause. Interstellar comes down very firmly behind the idea of emotional connection between people. That's why I wanted the Dylan Thomas poem.
Rage against the dying of the light.
That is exactly what I'm talking about. You rage because the lights are dimming. Time certainly is the enemy, quite specifically so in Interstellar, an insidious force, one that can play tricks on you. I don't think there was ever any question that I could or would let time win. For me, the film is really about a father, the sense of your life passing you by and your kids growing up before your eyes. Very much what I felt watching Richard Linklater's Boyhood, an extraordinary film which did the same thing in a completely different way. We all deal with this. There's a very positive side to it. I think that's where some of the optimism in the film comes from. The very sadness of saying goodbye to people is a massive expression of the love you feel for them. It is a very important part of the recognition, how strong the bonds are. Interstellar takes a similar approach to science fiction that was taken by Stanley Kubrick in its blending of hard procedural science disrupted by psychedelia and the abstract. But Nolan takes things a step further and injects these classical sensibilities with raw emotion. He marries his love for film with his love for family, resulting in a deeply personal film, and one that I will argue in this video is the single greatest work of film science fiction in at least a decade. I mean, I'll even take it a step further. I think it is the most important science fiction film of the 21st century.
Kubrick's film made such an impression on me as a kid. I mean, I certainly can't claim to have understood it, but I'm not sure I understand it now. But
Does the film need to be understood?
I don't think it does, and I think that 2001 is one of those rare instances where it doesn't need to be understood, it needs to be felt, and you just need to have this great experience.
You know, what's the potential, what's the possibility of cinema? And yeah, going to Leicester Square with my dad to go see 2001 and seeing this enormous experience on the huge screen kind of unfold before me, that's a feeling I've been trying to get back to in the films I've made, and I'd love to give some of that feeling to kids today.
And judging by the re-release box office receipts, I think there's a lot of you that agree with that. Nolan had a formative experience seeing 2001 with his father, and this movie feels like a direct function of that experience, both of Kubrick's film itself, but also a memory forged between father and son that becomes a snapshot of emotion that transcends time. Interstellar is a blending of loving familial memory and science fiction. It represents the beauty of film and the power of human bonds. In the film, Dr. Brand asserts that
this crew represents the best of humanity.
And I would argue that Interstellar, as a total cinematic experience, represents the best of humanity. While one could argue that this was Nolan's first truly warm and humanist film, if you really think that you weren't paying attention, but whatever, I think it would be more accurate to say that this is the film in which his sentimentality came into a sharper relief for audiences. If you go back and look at every film he's made, there's a resonant, emotional core, no matter how walled off their protagonists may be. What he finds emotional in Interstellar is the same thing he found emotional in Memento, Batman Begins, Inception, and The Dark Knight Rises: abandonment.
Pray you never learn just how good it can be to see another face.
Often the word cold is used, and I just think there's always an operatic sense of yearning in every one of your films. And I wonder why people tend to overlook that or dismiss that.
I don't think audiences do. certainly the response that we've had over the years to the films we've put out, audiences do seem very much to get wrapped up in the operatic elements of what it is we're doing. I think Interstellar is quite obviously an emotional film. It actually deals with emotion as a narrative feature of the film. Of course, even as I talk about it like that, I'm starting to sound very cold about the place of emotion in the film. But I do find the film very emotional myself.
At the core of Interstellar is the idea of human beings communing with future selves to bring about their own salvation. This theme can be found figuratively in Dunkirk, with its sneaky temporality cutting between the Tom Hardy character and the more immediate conflict. And of course, very literally in a film near and dear to my heart, Tenet, a film that follows this conceit to its most hyperbolic and brilliant end. The story of Cooper and Murph is the story of a man saving his daughter so she can save him. For a suave, buttoned-up Brit known for his documents of rigor and consummate professionalism, Christopher Nolan harbors a poorly kept secret. He loves people.
I'm an optimist when it comes to people. I think we're good at recognizing the things we're doing wrong and not necessarily fixing it right away, but at aiming and striving.
What's happened's happened, which is an expression of faith in the mechanics of the world. It's not an excuse to do nothing.
While this is a line from Tenet, it also serves to summarize a central theme of Interstellar. Nolan, much like quantum physicists, is very interested in looking at the concept of time, often taken for granted, and casting it in fresh terms, whether corporeal, the extra-dimensional bookshelf finale, or simply reordered. If we think of time as being immutable, then it's easy to give up and feel that the bad things that have happened will dictate the future. But what if the causal relationship between the future and the past is a two-way street? In Interstellar, there is a very literal future in the Coop who experiences time differently than those on Earth and interacts with the past outside of familiar dimensions. But there is also a future that exists in material form, in his daughter. The relationship between Coop and Murph is the animating force of this film. Coop represents the unrelenting human spirit, and Murph very literally represents the future. And if the future is already here, then there must be a solution to our problems. In the words of Matthew McConaughey,
the best exports we can have, if we do it well, is our children.
Given the importance of the father-daughter relationship in the film, you might expect that Interstellar was initially conceived as a father-daughter story, but the development journey of the film was more of an organic transformation. I very much related to the dilemma of somebody who is having to go off and do this thing, leave his kids whom he dearly wants to be with, but really wants to go do this thing. My job is something that I absolutely love. I consider myself unbelievably lucky to do it. But there is a lot of guilt involved in doing that. A lot of guilt. I have a daughter who is the same age as the character. In my brother's draft, it was a son. I turned it into a daughter because Flora was about the same age I was making it. As my kids were growing up, I had this desire to hang on to the past. You become quite melancholy about how fast it's going. All parents talk about it. All parents experience it. So Interstellar came from a very personal place. When Jonathan Nolan put pen to paper, he didn't set out to tell the story of Cooper and Murph, but when Christopher Nolan read it, he couldn't help but think of his own daughter who would be at home when he set off to make the film. How would she change in that time? What key moments of childhood would he witness only from afar? How would he reconcile the impossible conflict between wanting to tell stories and make films with wanting to spend every moment possible with his family? On the other hand, he can't possibly quit doing what he loves, but on the other, there are beautiful moments that will be lost to time. In Interstellar, the relationship between Murphy and her dad is the most important one in the film. Don't get me wrong, the entire film is a thoughtfully constructed web of intimate relationships, but there is none more powerful than that of the father and daughter. Some of the most memorable moments in the film exist simply in the way that McConaughey looks at his daughter, whether as a child, a middle-aged woman, or eventually an elderly woman on her deathbed. When Murph sneaks into the truck before they seek out the source of the mysterious gravitational coordinates and they share a smile, or the crushing moment Coop first sees that his daughter has grown up while visiting the first of Interstellar's worlds, his love for her is one of Interstellar's most palpable elements. But while the way he exists as a constant age for the entirety of Murph's life is very literal in the film, Nolan conceives of their relationship as also having a figurative reading. You could read it as a ghost story. The notion of the parent as a ghost of the child's future. That was in the fable that I gave Hans, because I wanted him to write music that was the emotional heart of that story. It's about the parents revisiting the child as a ghost and struggling to then be free. That is simply one of the most beautiful ideas to encapsulate in film, and I don't think anyone else could have done that as poetically as Christopher Nolan. There's something simultaneously sad and comforting about a parent being the ghost of their child's future. With death comes a certain sadness, but there is also something beautiful in knowing that your love and influence will endure long after you've gone. If you love your child and their world, they will thrive. When Christopher Nolan began the filmmaking process, his working title for the project was Flora's Letter, a constant reminder of the young child he had left behind. This inarticulable, powerful human connection is something that connects Coop and Murph across light years, but also, on a metatextual level, it's a resonant idea that inspired Nolan and his creative collaborators to reach for transcendence. They all had families they would miss dearly while making the film, and they would use those feelings to imbue their art with raw feeling. The organ thing, I cursed Hans with that. I said, look, I really want a pipe organ. Have you ever done a score with that? He'd never worked with the organ on other film scores, so he was a bit daunted, but he threw himself into it. On Interstellar, I was very interested in playing with the idea of the organ as one of these tools to inspire religiosity or awe, and so very often, if you listen very carefully to what we're doing in the music, a piece of music will end abruptly, and you can hear the reverberations ring out. We were actually using the confined space of Temple Church. By hearing the echo of the music ringing out, we're using it to create a sense of space, even though it's actually created by confinement. It's a very architectural idea. So if you walk into a cathedral, all of that inspires awe. And Interstellar is quite specifically not a religious film, but you're still looking for what you can tap into, what associations you can use to create a feeling of awe. And the organ felt like that. Of all the takeaways from seeing Interstellar, one of the first is surely that the score is an absolute fucking masterclass of film composition. I mean, Hans Zimmer himself even claims that it might be his magnum opus, the greatest piece of music he's ever written. The orchestral swells feel breathtaking and timeless, but they're also imbued with a level of emotion that would seem almost impossible to capture in melody. And the origin of this is one of my favorite production stories, period. For Hans Zimmer to reach such soaring heights, you would expect that he had at least read the full script or seen footage that captured the scale and dialectic between human love and unfathomable cosmic scale, but the truth is that he was working from something much smaller, more elemental. I called Hans before I even knew I was going to do this project, and I told him, I'm going to bring you an envelope with a letter in it, on a piece of paper that's going to tell you the underlying fable at the heart of the film that we're going to make next. It has a couple of lines from the film. It's the heart of the film. You get one day. Just write something, and you have to give it to me at the end of the day, and that'll be the seed from which we can grow the score. We realized we spent so much time on the other films we'd done near the end of the process trying to penetrate the mechanisms we'd created and get back to the heart of the story. This time, I thought, let's flip the process. Let's start with the score and then build out.
Came over and he sat down on the couch and I said, okay, I'll play to you. And I played him this fragile little piece that I'd written about my son, really, relationship I have with my son. And I get to the end of it and I'm going, so what do you think? Of course, well, I better make the movie then. I'm going, what is the movie? And he started talking about space and huge and epic and all this. And then finally I'm going, stop, stop.
Yeah.
I've written this tiny, tiny little thing, this really fragile, personal thing. And he goes, yeah, I know where the heart of the movie is now.
Once your children are born, you can never look at yourself through your own eyes anymore. You always look at yourself through their eyes. The fact that the music we have come to associate with the grand scope of the film was largely inspired not by deep space, but human love and connection speaks to the elemental power felt through Interstellar. The impact of the spectacle is stunning, don't get me wrong, but equally as impactful is the greatest strength of the human race, the bond between people. The greatest cinematic experience comes from the most personal of feelings. As Coop and Dr. Brand travel deeper into space and farther from Earth, the film almost paradoxically becomes more about the human story rather than less. As they're further isolated from humanity, from society, the strength of their bond and developing relationship takes on a power and singularity that would be impossible to achieve in a traditional social context.
So therein lies a very intimate science fiction film, which I think is brought up in this. And it's not about going out there, it's actually about coming right back in here, which is an experience I really enjoy with the film, and the fact that the further out there that we go, the more personal the film actually becomes.
The further out into the infinite we went, and the more we isolated these characters who have to go across the universe, the more the focus naturally becomes on their humanity, on that intimate bond they have, what makes us human, all those issues. I think there's something about the starkness and the massiveness of the environment they're in that really reduces this focus very tightly to human bonds and what makes us who we are.
The core of Interstellar is about a daughter using the wisdom her father imparted to achieve something profound. The knowledge, which was in turn imparted to the father by the ghosts that have likewise guided him, empowers the daughter to accomplish something neither her father nor all those who preceded her could ever have hoped to achieve in a single lifetime. In the end, it's the totality of human knowledge compounded over generations that leads to humanity's salvation. Knowledge passed down through space and time through love. But Murph and Coop are not the only father and daughter relationship key to understanding Interstellar. You also have Anne Hathaway's Dr. Brand and her father, Michael Caine's Dr. Brand Sr., or I guess Professor Brand, whatever, we'll just refer to him as John Freeze. Matt Damon's cowardly astronaut is the only true villain of the film, but John occupies a controversial station. Dr. Brand's life and work represent the film's duality of love and hard science.
Led to this really important part of my character, which was feelings matter. It wasn't just about the science, and I loved the idea of playing a skeptic and a spiritualist. You never get to do that. And we live in a time where we think of, at least I encounter the world as, the way it's presented to me is in binary forms. We're very much either or. And Stephen Sondheim has this great line in a song, which is, must it all be either less or more, either plain or grand? Is it always or? Is it never and? And I thought my character really got into the and.
She has dedicated herself to her father's research and principles, believing that he is the person who can chart a course for humanity's salvation. After the midpoint of the film, we learn that he has been lying about the ability to ship humans off of Earth's surface to a new terrestrial home because this is the only way to convince Coop and Dr. Brand to travel to deep space to find a home for a new colony. It's the only way to convince people to work together if they have a common objective that they can work towards. In this case, it's saving the human race. When Dr. Brand learns of this after his death, she is crushed and has a crisis of faith. But in the end, John did what he did for love, and while his methods were dubious, his intentions were good, which ultimately paved the way for Coop and Brand discovering a true solution to the problem of gravity, a great scientific achievement made possible only because of great love. In many contexts, emotion and intelligence are thought to exist separately, but Nolan endeavors to make the argument that the two are inextricably linked, that the passing of knowledge and the human spirit use love, at the very minimum, as a conduit. To Nolan, there is no future without love. It is our greatest strength and our greatest form of resistance. And it's telling that the two antagonistic figures in the film, Man and Professor Brand, kind of collapse because of their inability to reconcile the subjective emotional experience with the objective hard facts of science. They can't see one as being a vessel to interpret the other, and so they're both driven to desperation as a result. Now, we've talked a lot about the function of human emotion in Interstellar and its utility as a tool to overcome obstacles, but the brilliance of Interstellar is not in the way it roots grand narrative in a power that lies within us all, but in the way it insists that the problems we face now, however grand they may seem, are the same ones we have always faced. Interstellar takes place in a science fiction future ravaged by climate disaster, but it uses a stark minimalism and familiar language during its extended Earthbound setup to ensure that the audience is not transported to a fanciful world, but grounded in one they recognize. While it is true that the space adventure of the film takes great inspiration from Kubrick's work on 2001, the film continuously grounds itself in a believable future and is equally inspired by the work of Ken Burns.
The influence of Ken Burns' Dust Bowl documentary is profound on the film, and I felt like it would be a very valuable thing to look at in terms of agricultural disaster, in terms of, okay, well, what really happens when there's a significant breakdown in a farming community. Over the 6 hours watching it, it struck me that the imagery that he had uncovered, what he was presenting there, was so much more extraordinary than anything you see in a science fiction film. I really wanted to try and bring the audience's attention to the idea that not only could it happen like this, it actually already has happened even worse.
Grounding the Earth sections of the film in the intimacy of Cooper's family and their agrarian world keeps Interstellar from ever kneecapping its realist sections with sensationalism. A problem with many science fiction films, not from a qualitative standpoint, but from an audience immersion standpoint, is that the core conflicts are often degrees enough removed from our present reality that it's easier to distance ourselves from their fiction. In Blade Runner, it's not difficult to understand the plight of the replicants as societal pariah lacking freedoms despite being rendered conscious without their own consent, but few of us have experience with advanced AI attaining consciousness and then creating all sorts of moral conundrums. In Annihilation, it's easy to see the third act suicide ballet as a representation of the allure of self-destruction, but, and correct me if I'm wrong, very few of us have ever wielded automatic rifles against a cosmic unfurling. In Interstellar, however, we see cornfields, we see a blue-collar family who love each other and talk shit despite impending global doom. We see a dust bowl, food scarcity, things for which there are real-world reference and precedent for triumph. Surely, prairie dwellers in the American 1930s felt that their ecological disaster was a sort of apocalypse, but they persevered and their families have lived on to tell their stories.
With science fiction, the danger is that the human element gets lost. And so I think incorporating an organic, people-based methodology to every aspect of the film, whether it was the recording of the music or the miniatures or costumes, all of these things, so really trying to always retain the human element, I think grounds the film. We want it to feel relatable, we want it to feel tactile, because ultimately the film is about human beings, what binds us together, what divides us, these kind of things.
By grounding this film in echoes of recent human history, we're reminded that no matter the challenges we face, humans can overcome them because we've done it before. We don't see any of the usual ways the apocalypse is conveyed in disaster and science fiction movies. A maximalist movie made in the minimalist mode. Interstellar instead gives us a series of talking heads who seem to be participating in a Ken Burns-style documentary about the blight, shots of dusty plates on dinner tables, and a father trying to keep his young daughter, Murph, in school. Working from a blue-green palette, cinematographer Hoyte van Hoytema finds a Malachian glimmer in the early dawn light, shooting the Calgary cornfields with a texture and rawness that is far removed from the sheen of Wally Pfister's images for the Dark Knight films, while the first notes of Hans Zimmer's pipe organ turn the horizon line with its distant mountains into their own expectant mystery. The film is horizontals, not the verticals you might expect from the title. While the grounded reality in the Earth of Interstellar is an invitation to the audience to connect with the film on a deep, emotional level, it also left Nolan a little exposed for the first time. In an age fueled by irony and detachment, there's a fear of being earnest or, God forbid, a little corny. But the people who fear this mode are only hurting themselves. Let's talk a bit about the arc of Interstellar's reputation. Of all Nolan's films, Interstellar had perhaps the roughest ride with critics, if not audiences. Online analysis of the perceived plot holes in the film, from 21 things in Interstellar that don't make sense by the New York Magazine to 15 maddening Interstellar plot holes from Entertainment Weekly, to the slightly less picky 3 Interstellar plot holes that make no sense from Business Insider, reached the density of a small black hole. Objections ranged from the pedantic to the amusingly pedantic. Who in the universe would ever know the titles of all their books from behind on a bookshelf? To the genuinely perplexed. Rather than nitpick Nolan with a barrage of complaints, I present him with what seems to me the biggest one, the Deus Ex Machina device of the 5-dimensional beings who orchestrate the entire plot, placing the Tesseract in the black hole so that, rather than perishing there, Cooper can communicate with his daughter and feed her the data that will allow her to save mankind from extinction. It's quite an intervention. Nolan is normally so scrupulous about eliminating any sign of the puppeteer's hand from his own pictures, to the point of fretting over the final shot of Inception because the POV seems to be none other than his own, but something about 5-dimensional beings seems to bring out his bossier side. The audience must go along with those 5-dimensional beings and the hand they lend the plot, no matter that it passes all ordinary understanding. So let's talk about the controversial extra-dimensional bookshelf. It seems a little silly to mount a defense of a now-beloved film, but I do think there remains a staunch group of Interstellar haters who zero in on one sequence in particular. A common refrain when people speak to Interstellar is that they're more or less on board until Coop jettisons himself into the heart of the wormhole, where he communes with an extraterrestrial, a temporal grid that allows him to speak to Murph through a gravitational pulley system inexplicably linked to the bookshelf that set them off on their initial journey. Tom Schoen does a pretty good job of articulating the emotional function of this space. The Tesseract is an eternal hall of parental regret, forcing him to replay opportunities missed, things not said, paths not taken. Like Leonard Shelby's looped life, it has the timelessness of trauma, endlessly relived, but unlike the limbo into which Shelby finds himself cast, Cooper is not entirely without agency and finds he can communicate with Murph through the watch he left her, manipulating the second hand like a quadriplegic blinking out his autobiography. The Tesseract is the most fantastical image in Interstellar, and the one that most evokes the comparisons to 2001, namely the psychedelic finale, but it's also an object of ridicule for certain audience members who find it mawkish and silly, particularly in comparison to the rest of the film, which feels at least somewhat derivative of hard science. They find it absurd that this trans-dimensional construct would be visually represented by this pedestrian human space, but what they're failing to consider is the interaction between a subjective observer and their environment. Remember I mentioned this earlier? I told you I was going somewhere with the science dork speak. At the top of this video, I spoke to the quantum physicist's notion of a malleable particle world that is subject to the micro-influence of its observer. While this is true in everyday life, it is significantly more impactful when a human is confronted by stimuli beyond their comprehension. When people experience near-death or mystical experiences, their brains are overwhelmed by stimuli with no real-world reference. In the case of total overload, the mind will do its best to construct a sensory representation based on familial building blocks. In Cooper's case, the family bookshelf. While the interactions between Coop and Murph are material. The visual representation is as much a product of his own subjectivity as it is a hard reality. To me, this feels like Nolan, even at his most fantastical, is still rooting his work in scientific theory. As a rule, I don't find pedantic film watching to be a very interesting approach to the medium. To look at Interstellar in the most literal terms is to miss the forest for the trees. This is a metaphysical experience, and if you're to allow yourself to be swept up in it, the rewards are endless. What I've found is the people who let the film wash over them get the most out of it. They're not approaching it like a crossword puzzle or like they're going to get a test afterwards. Certainly online, my films are held to a weirdly high standard in terms of plot contrivances. I don't really know why that is. In a way, I suppose it should be a compliment. I think the structures I've used, when you use a nonlinear plot structure, and with the genres I've worked in, you do invite more scrutiny. Rules are very important to audiences, they really are. People are ruthless, but I am very, very consistent with my rule set. You make mistakes, of course, but I never admit those mistakes, and they are almost never picked up on by the nitpickers. What you don't want as a filmmaker is when it feels restrictive. I want to be able to avail myself of the appropriate traditions of conceit and narrative. There's a very good Roger Ebert book about stuff that only happens in movies. No one ever pays for a cab, or the engine's always running when they get in a car. Any character that has an architectural model in his office is a bad guy, and I've done a couple of movies with architectural models in them. So movies are full of these wonderful rule sets. I don't want to be treated any differently. In other words, I want to be able to make films where nobody pays for a cab. Put it another way, Inception's not real. Batman's not real. There's a leap that you're asking the audience to make. You're providing suspension of disbelief. But at some point, these things just aren't true. I think you're missing the narrative point, which is that jumping into black holes is the ultimate act of faith. Cooper's caught by creatures who you know exist, and you've been wondering who they are for the entire film. Who are they? It's said in the first act. It's all up front. Who put the wormhole there? And so they're not a deus ex machina, they're specified right from the beginning, whether you like it or not. For people who like the film, they don't read the Tesseract as a deus ex machina. They understand where it's coming from.
One of the things about the film right from the beginning that we all really believed is it feels like time to try and inspire another generation to really look outwards and look to the stars again. When I was a child, people were still visiting the moon. When I was a child, the first probes were being sent right out into the solar system and indeed eventually beyond. And I think it's time to get back to that. We really hoped that by dramatizing these ideas, by dramatizing science and making it something that hopefully could be entertaining for kids, we might, inspire some of the astronauts of tomorrow. I mean, that would be the ultimate goal of the project, really.
Newton's third law. You gotta leave something behind.
This is a refrain repeated in Interstellar to demonstrate the sacrifice necessary to save the world. But what's so moving about Interstellar and Cooper's unrelenting perseverance is that he's not even willing to accept that fundamental truth in his pursuit of human salvation. Even when he tries to leave himself behind, his love for Murph transcends the laws that govern the universe and reveals itself to be the most powerful force of all. Some audiences will struggle to connect with the heart-on-its-sleeve message of the film because it's quite difficult to render oneself vulnerable enough to embrace the idea that letting our walls down and letting love in is a shelter in a solar storm, our best hope for the future. Therein lies the paradox of Interstellar. Its detractors are unable to embrace its liberating message of love, thus depriving themselves of hope. But, it's never too late to get on this ship, and if you can let it in, you will understand why Interstellar was 10 years ago and is today a masterpiece.
Humans' love song to the planet, but also to the species. I think it really is about human beings and what we're capable of in a very positive sense. That's why I think, even though we're dealing with a film that in a lot of ways is about the end of days, about the end of the world, I think it's very optimistic, very hopeful.